Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. This one's a bit of a quick turnaround review because I've been able to get my hands on the Denafrips Artemis amplifier here, headphone amplifier, for a very quick turnaround. So I've had this for about 1 week, and in that time I've put it through its paces, tried to get as detailed an understanding of the amplifier as I can, but I do want to flag that it's a bit of a quicker turnaround than I usually like, and so there might be some details I miss, but hopefully there won't be. The Artemis retails here in Australia for 3,300 Australian dollars, so it's a fairly flagship level headphone amplifier. Technically you can spend more on a headphone amp, but at this level you're going to be expecting absolute top of the line performance. It's massive, as you can see, it's made of aluminium, it's pretty much solid all over, and it's pretty spectacular to behold. So the big question of course is, does it sound any good? As you'd probably expect, the very first thing you notice about the Artemis is just how hefty it is. So this is built on the same chassis as the top of the range Denafrips DACs, and it will stack perfectly with them. It's a really hefty piece of equipment. You can see here everything is metal, it's got the 3 feet, the same as the other Denafrips products, and it really is a beast. It's one of the most spectacular unboxing experiences I've had to date. When you first look at the amplifier, you might notice a few things that are a little bit unusual. First of all, it uses not 3 4-pin XLRs as you might think. So there's not 3 balanced outputs here, there's actually 3 outputs in total, being a 6.3mm single-ended output, a pair of 3-pin XLRs for balanced, and a single 4-pin XLR for balanced. So you can use it in multiple different ways. All of my testing has been conducted using the 6.3mm and the 4-pin XLR. The other things going on the front panel are we've got a power switch over here and an input selector switch. There's lots of inputs to choose from, as I'll show you in a second, so you need that switch to cycle through the different choices. Like other Denafrips products, it uses very small LEDs to show you what's been selected. So once again, some people, depending on how far you sit from the device and or the angle that you're looking at it, some may find it's very hard to see which input is selected. For me, I didn't have any problems here on my desk, but I do know that some people might have issues with that. Finally, over on this side, we've got a volume knob that's quite large, it's good to turn and interact with, and it's connected to a fantastic stepped potentiometer. So what that means is every single turn of the dial has a really satisfying click to it, and each step is very, very precise, right down to the lowest volume levels. Let's swing it around now and take a look at the back. I don't know if you can tell how much effort that is, but this is a heavy beast. So on the back here, we've got a number of inputs, as I mentioned before, so you've got plenty of versatility with how many different devices you feed into the Artemis. You've got 3 different XLR inputs, so they're split across with the left channel on this side, the right channel on this side, and then you've got a single pair of single-ended RCAs. Other than that, you've got the input for the power, and that's it. So it's a very simple design in terms of the inputs. There's no preamp outputs, there's no pass-throughs. It just takes a signal in, processes it in a Class A design, and spits out either a balanced or a single-ended signal. What's going on inside of this amplifier is a whole lot of really carefully selected, high-quality circuitry. It uses a toroidal transformer for the power, so it's a linear power supply. It also uses a big bank of capacitors to make sure that power supply is clean. It uses the stepped potentiometer that I spoke about so that each step is perfectly channel balanced, and in theory with step potentiometers like this you can get a much cleaner pass through of the signal as well. So everything about the Artemis screams quality and precision engineering. The big question of course is, what does that mean when you plug it in and have a listen to it? Does it produce enough power? Does that power sound good? Etc. So let's talk briefly about the power. The Artemis will put 4 watts into 32 ohms. That means it has more than enough power for even the hungriest of headphones. I did read during my preparation for this review that it was almost maxed out driving a HiFiMan Susvara, so that tells me that there will be some headphones where this is going to reach its limit, but realistically, unless you have a ridiculously difficult to drive headphone, all of the standard headphones work fine. In my experience, it was very comfortable with Focal Clears, Mezza Empyreans, HD800S, anything within that normal range of most headphones is going to be fine. Where it seems like it's going to struggle, if anywhere, is very low sensitivity and relatively low impedance planar magnetic headphones. While we're talking about different loads and different headphones, I did try this briefly with IEMs, and it's not an IEM amplifier. There's quite a lot of power hums. That sort of 50 Hertz power hum comes through very obviously with IEMs. So don't think of this as a multi-purpose headphone IEM amplifier. This is a pure headphone amplifier only. With that said, don't worry about the power noise for full-sized headphones. I had no issues with anything I tried it with. It's just on IEMs where they're so sensitive and the drivers are so small that they very easily pick up things like power hum. In terms of sound quality and sound presentation, when you do fire this up with full-sized headphones, you're met with an incredibly enjoyable, rich sound. The presentation from the Artemis is very much in keeping with what I would expect having heard the Denafrips Aries 2. Unlike the Denafrips Aries 2, where I did feel like it was a little bit too smoothed off at times in terms of the details, there's no lack of detail in the Artemis, but at the same time it's got a really nice, thick in a good way sound that gives a sense of weight and body to all of the music. It's immediately seductive and enjoyable when you put on your favourite tracks and hear the sense of presence that the Artemis brings to them. It's not the last word in resolution and detail. I think other amplifiers can very comfortably best it in that area, but it's absolutely an enjoyable listening experience. I'll give you some specific comparisons shortly to put that into context, but first let's talk about the general characteristics of the Artemis's sound. First and foremost, as I've already alluded to, what I noticed was the mid-range and the weight of notes from the Artemis is definitely its kind of party piece, if you like. It's got good extension into bass and treble. There's no issues with frequency range or the linearity of that frequency range overall, but it's got this weight and this thickness to the presentation that some people may find too thick, others will absolutely adore. For me, it probably tips the scales just ever so slightly too thick, but as I said, that's for me and my personal tastes, and that's probably because many of my headphones are already quite warm headphones. Pairing this up with something like an HD800S is a little bit of a match made in heaven. It brings everything I don't like about the HD800S down and amplifies all the things that I find it lacking. The soundstage from the Artemis is a good size and a good amount of space, as you'd expect from a high quality, discreet design like this one. Because of that mid-range presence and weight though, what I've found was that it's quite an intimate soundstage. It brings the mid-range forward a little bit, and so everything does feel a bit more intimate than some of the leaner and more spacious sounding amplifiers. That's in no way a knock. I never felt like it was claustrophobic. I thought there was a very nice sense of layering and depth in the soundstage. It just wasn't as big and expansive as some of the headphone amplifiers I've listened to. While we're talking general sound quality, I should mention that I put this through its paces with both the single-ended and the balanced inputs, as well as the single-ended and the balanced outputs, being the 6.3mm and the 4-pin XLR. I didn't try, because I didn't have any appropriate setup, the 3-pin XLR combo. So using the single-ended did change the characteristics of the sound slightly. What I found was that the sound got just a little bit less transparent on single-ended, and that's not uncommon when you've got a balanced amplifier that's giving you a single-ended output as a matter of convenience, is sometimes you're not going to get the premium level of quality that you can get from the balanced outputs. That's not a rule across the board for all balanced amps, but it is the case for the Artemis. As a result of that, on single-ended, the soundstage got a little bit narrower and the sound was overall just a bit thicker across the board. Again, that's not the end of the world. It just depends on what you're pairing it with. It was still an exceptional sounding amp and worked beautifully with something like the HD800S, but I did notice the thickness with something that's already quite rich in terms of the Mezza Empyreans. So it's going to be horses for courses on that one. The good news is, if you can connect up to the balanced output, you're going to enjoy everything that the Artemis has to offer. In terms of outputs and inputs, I found the same story true for both the single-ended input versus the balanced input and the single-ended output versus the balanced output. In other words, If you're feeding or outputting single-ended, you are going to narrow the soundstage and thicken the sound slightly. If you keep everything balanced beginning to end, you'll find you get the absolute best out of this amplifier. So I definitely recommend this for those running balanced, but it's not to say you shouldn't enjoy single-ended as well. For example, if you had this set up with a balanced input coming from your DAC, and most of the time you're using a 4-pin XLR or a pair of 3-pin XLRs for your headphones, but occasionally want to plug in something that's a single-ended headphone, you're still going to enjoy fantastic sound. It's not one of those cases where it's absolute night and day. It's just that you're only getting maybe 90% of the sound quality from single-ended versus the full 100% from balanced. So far, on its own, the Artemis is a wonderful sounding amplifier that has its very own sonic character, but it's a very enjoyable character. To help with your decision making though, let me give you some comparisons so you can weigh up exactly where this sits on the continuum and exactly what you like the sound of. I started off with the Monolith Liquid Platinum, which happened to arrive recently. I'm preparing for a review of that one, so if you do want to see that, make sure you hit the subscribe button. But I thought it was interesting to put these two up against one another. The main reason being that the Liquid Platinum is a hybrid tube amp, and the Artemis, despite being solid state, does a number of things that sound quite tubey. With that in mind, I compared the two, and there was no contest. The Artemis ran away with it in terms of overall sound quality. There is definitely a similarity in tonality between the two, with the Artemis having that richness and weight in the mid-range that the tubes help to bring to the Liquid Platinum. But in all other ways, the Artemis was just more transparent, there was more nuance, more layering, and it's just in a different league to the Monolith, as you'd expect. So I moved on to other amplifiers that are more in line with the level of quality of the Artemis. And the first thing I tried was the Hugo TT2. The Hugo TT2 is insanely transparent. It's one of the most transparent amps I've heard. And so putting it up against the Artemis is a bit of a tough challenge for an amplifier here that I've already said is not the most transparent. What I found though is, similar to my experiences with the Auralic Taurus Mark II, the Artemis brings a nice sense of warmth to the sound compared to the TT2. Some people will find the TT2 perhaps a bit too dry and a bit too analytical, whereas the Artemis fixes that with this wonderful injection of soul and rhythm and weight to the music. One drawback of that extra weight is the bass from the Artemis does come across a bit slow. Whereas the bass coming from the TT2 was snappy and clean and punchy, I did feel like things just got a little bit, like a half step behind the beat with some of the bass coming out of the Artemis. It wasn't bad, it wasn't a reason not to buy it, but it's something worth noting. If you like your music really sharp and snappy in terms of rhythm, the Artemis probably doesn't quite do that. What it does on the other hand though, is it makes all the mid-range so rich and engaging that if you're a fan of mids, I think you'll really like the Artemis. One of the tracks I tried for this test was Fade to Blue by Bill Perry. And on that track, what I found was that I definitely noticed the difference in transparency between the TT2 and the Artemis. But with the Artemis, the mid-range was so much more focused and present. Everything became more intimate, as I said before, and it definitely brought the vocals into focus. That's not to say it improved the imaging of it, it just brought my attention on the vocals much more strongly in the case of the Artemis compared to the TT2. So if you're a vocal lover, and particularly if you've got a pair of headphones that have just a little bit more sort of treble and a little bit less mid-range emphasis, you'll probably find the Artemis a really nice balance point for you. I actually would have loved it if I'd still had the Taurus Mark II here, because what I think is going on is that the Artemis is probably just a little bit thicker still than the Taurus Mark II. And so in a continuum, you'd have the TT2 in the absolute transparency end, you'd have the Artemis at not quite the absolute thickness end, but much more towards the thicker, richer mid-range end, and the Taurus Mark II somewhere in the middle, but leaning towards the Artemis. I'm not sure how the Taurus Mark II would stack up in terms of transparency, but I have a feeling that it might be just a hair better than the Artemis, although it's tough to say without having them side by side. What I do know is that I really enjoy the Artemis for what it does, but it's definitely an amplifier that you need to buy knowing what it does, which is bringing that extra weight and that richness to the mid-range. My final comparison was again coming back to tubes, but this time a more equal comparison with something that should play at the same level as the Artemis, and that's the Bottlehead Mainline. For this test, I was listening to The Thing About Grief by Claire Bowditch, And what I found, which was really interesting, was that the bass from the Artemis was definitely a bit slower and fuller than that from the Mainline. That generally goes against what people expect from solid state versus tubes. Normally tubes have the thicker, fluffier bass, whereas the solid state is normally cleaner and sharper. In this case though, the Mainline was tighter, the Artemis was a bit fuller. Once again, the mids were thicker on the Artemis than they were on the Mainline, but things were closer compared to, say, the TT2 and the Artemis. The Mainline was closer to the Artemis than it was to the TT2. That also meant that the Mainline, the way I've got it set up with my capacitors that I've added to it, is a more transparent amplifier than the Artemis. The Artemis has the edge in terms of that richness and engagement of the mids once again. I found that when listening on the Mainline, I was able to hear details in the background more easily, so the subtle details kind of behind the main part of the music were easier to hear on the Mainline. They were still there on the Artemis, but I really had to listen for them if I wanted to hear them. That was a bit of a shock to me because as much as I know the Mainline to be a very transparent tube amp, it's unusual that it out-transparents, if that's a word, a solid-state amplifier. And it goes to show just how coloured, and I know some people are going to hear that as a negative, but I don't think it has to be. It goes to show how coloured the sound is from the Artemis. This is an amplifier that is unashamedly rich and lush and all about enjoying the music with smoothness and mid-range engagement. It's not trying to be the last word in transparency or sterility or neutrality. That's just not what it's meant to do. What it's doing is it's delivering a very romantic and seductive take on the music. It never gets muddy, it never gets too rich, and I never felt like it went too far. I thoroughly enjoyed every single track that I listened to on the Artemis. And so that for me is probably the biggest message I wanted to put forward in this review, which is this is an example of how to do a coloured amp just right. It's inevitable that in adding that richness, they have to give up some of the transparency, but they've done it in such a way that I never felt like it wasn't transparent when listening to the Artemis on its own. It was only in A/B comparisons with other amplifiers that I heard the difference between the two. So if you have a highly insightful headphone like an HD800S or a regular HD800, a Focal Utopia for instance, any of those headphones that are incredibly insightful, sometimes maybe tend towards being a little bit too lean, the Artemis is a fantastic amplifier to consider if you want a little bit more richness and engagement in your music. Of course, if you like lean and analytical and transparent, this is clearly not the amplifier for you, but it does what it does exceptionally well and it makes no apologies for it. If I didn't have the Mainline in my collection, this is an amp that I would strongly consider buying in the future because I do think it's excellent. The footprint is huge and that is a bit of a problem for a desktop setup like mine, but it's something I'd be willing to deal with for that wonderful, engaging and liquid sound that it produces. If you're in Australia and this sounds like an amp that you'd be interested in, the local supplier Dachman Audio has kindly offered $100 off to anyone mentioning this review when they purchase. So do reach out to Dachman Audio. I'll put a link down below for anyone in Australia. Do reach out to Dachman Audio if you're interested in this or any of the other Denafrips products. In the meantime though, thank you to Dachman Audio for making this review possible with the loan of the Artemis. I believe it's going to a good new home now. I'm sure that person's going to thoroughly enjoy it. And for everybody else, happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.